Space exploration truly brings out the best in us, encouraging people from all walks of life to work together to achieve a common goal, to know the cosmos and our place within it. We are the Planetary Society.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are across the world. I'm Mat Kaplan of the Planetary Society, host of our podcast and public radio series, Planetary Radio, back with something new this time, part of our Planetary Society Live series, but the first ever Space Policy Edition live. And so I am thrilled to be joined by our Chief Advocate and Senior Space Policy Advisor, Casey Dreier. Casey, welcome. We're live.
Hey, Matt. Happy to be here.
Isn't this fun? And hopefully this will be a regular rotating part of the Planetary Society Live series, just as What's Up Live was a couple of weeks ago with our colleague Bruce Betts.
Yeah, Matt, as you know, I can speak ad nauseum about space policy and politics, so I'm happy to do this as much as you're happy to have me here.
And you won't have to speak continuously this time because we will, of course, be taking questions over the bulk of this relatively short live interlude for Casey from all of you. And so you want to start getting those in now, if you like. We already have one that was submitted ahead of time. But before we get to that one, Casey, I just want to set things up because I'm sure there are a few people out there, a handful at least, who maybe are not familiar with the Planetary Society, and a few more who may not be familiar with advocacy and our work in public policy, which really has been at the heart of what the Society is all about from its beginning, hasn't it?
That's true. The Planetary Society was actually founded on the idea that public support for space exploration is very high, even if the budgets are relatively low. Back in 1980, particularly for planetary exploration, so it's in our name, that was the nadir of NASA investment in planetary exploration. The program itself almost completely wiped away out of NASA's slate during the very first years of the Reagan administration. The Planetary Society, by building a coalition of people, right? Anybody can be a member, anybody can be a part of this, by its very existence proves that people care about this. Particularly because to be a member, you put a few bucks, but not that much, but still money. People literally are putting their money, to believe in this basic idea of promoting space science and exploration. So something that we've done at the Society is, in addition to our outreach and our cool projects that we make, a significant investment programmatically is making sure that we are representing our members in the policy process that ultimately funds scientifically motivated space exploration. Now, what really makes us unique in this is that because we're the largest organization that does this with tens of thousands of members around the world, that we're able to really answer to them. And we don't answer to corporate sponsors. We don't answer to government grants. We're independent. And that is a real rarity in this field and one of the very few voices. So we play a really critical role in representing public opinion, public influence, public outcomes that we want to see in space exploration, not just where the jobs are going and not just, kind of what our immediate interests are, right? If we get more missions to the outer solar system or to Mars, I don't make extra money. The Planetary Society doesn't make extra money. We just get to enjoy it as individuals, seeing something exciting happening. So that's a core of what we do. And then also, of course, big part of that is educating anybody about the process of how space happens, which is political.
And, education for the general public as well, which is a good part of what we're doing right here. Not that any of you who are watching this are just mere members of the general public, because you've tuned in today. You obviously already care about space exploration and the advocacy work that is led by Casey and right up to our CEO, Bill Nye the Science Guy, who sends his regards today. Casey, any big news to share? I know that your latest edition of the Space Advocate, your monthly newsletter, just came out yesterday. Anything you want to share from there?
There's a lot about to happen in space, right? In the next decade, I'm talking about period. So there's a lot of exciting things starting to formulate and bubble up and to cohere in front of our eyes. Obviously, with human spaceflight, what's happening right now, actually, as we're talking, is the NASA Advisory Council's Committee on Human Exploration is meeting. They're getting briefings by NASA about their plans for Artemis to return humans to the moon in the next couple of years, ideally, how they're going to pull that off. We're also, of course, facing a decade of this increased exploration. We're a few years away from launching a mission to Europa, starting on Mars sample return, one of the biggest and most audacious planetary robotic missions ever conceived of to bring back samples from Mars to Earth. Really trying to create this whole new world of commercial public-private partnerships in space exploration to try to enable not just government investment in space, but private capital investment in space. All of these things are happening, and I don't think are necessarily unfamiliar to anyone who's watching here, but the meat is being placed on the skeletal concepts of this right now through executive orders, through the policy process, and then, of course, through the congressional process of setting legislation and funding for those ideals.
Casey, I have a feeling that some of what's happening, or more of what's happening in the news, is going to keep coming up as we run through questions from our other participants today. And so let me get to that first one, which is very much in keeping with that theme. And it came in actually to you from John, who wishes you well. He says, I hope you'll talk about the Crew Dragon launch, why it's proceeding on schedule, and any updates. Also would like to hear more about the Lunar Landing System contracts, those 3 companies that were just selected for preliminary work on a human lander on the moon. And then John adds, you do a great job. I'm sure today now, will be great. Well, thank you, John. We appreciate that. Okay, Casey, Crew Dragon, on track for May 27?
It seems to be. That's like 2 weeks away. Isn't that amazing to be looking at? Commercial Crew it's hard there's no historical analog for this, right? So it's hard to reach back in terms of history to really express how unusual and exciting this current situation is. I was doing some basic numbers, and so this is preliminary in terms of my analysis, but I was trying to think, NASA fought pretty hard, and the White House fought pretty hard to push forward the concept of commercial public-private partnerships into human access to space back in 2010, 2011 era under the Obama administration, with actually a pretty hostile, bipartisan coalition from members of Congress against the idea. They got the money, but it wasn't what they were it wasn't what they wanted, so they got less money than they needed. So the program timeline of Commercial Crew stretched out. Originally, they had hoped to launch in 2015. Then it became 2017. Technical problems for both SpaceX and Boeing pushed that further back to now, right, in 2020. We seem to be on the cusp of seeing the first company, SpaceX, successfully launch. Everything seems on track for that. Boeing, good chance they'll launch by this time next year with their Crew demonstration test. And if you look at the amount of money NASA has spent so far, it's around $6 billion over 10 years. Now, for space projects, that's nothing. That is so cheap, particularly for human space. Going back in history, I think that's the cheapest NASA investment in a human space capsule or spacecraft since like Mercury, the first one. And Mercury was basically just go up and down or around a couple of times for a couple of days and just sit in this tin can, right? And we're getting 2 spacecraft out of this deal. That's amazing, right? And so the gamble that was put into this is a political and policy gamble, right? That NASA could step back, give less money than normal, assume that there's some private investment to match that concept, and that companies would stand up to the challenge to take on building something very difficult, which is a human-capable, safe spacecraft that can go up and down, into low Earth orbit. That was not universally accepted in 2010. There's a lot of pushback on that idea. And the gamble seems to be about to pay off. And everything about that gamble is the advantage, right? Like it costs less by a huge amount, right? And then NASA was just reporting yesterday into the advisory council that it costs something like $25 billion less than it would through the classic method of contracting that they had always worked with, and that we're going to get, again, two redundant and completely independent means to access low Earth orbit. The Boeing Starliner, which launches on the Atlas V, and then the SpaceX's Dragon 2 that launches on the Falcon 9. Those are completely, so one goes down, they have a completely independent access to space from that. Great deal. So tying this together to the other question about human lander contracts, the idea now is that, well, if commercial crew, the process of NASA giving a limited investment, stepping back from a regulatory standpoint, letting the companies, giving them more freedom effectively to work more efficiently and faster, that seems to be paying off for commercial crew. Can it now be applied to landing people on the moon? No one knows the answer to this, right? Like, we have one data point of successfully landing humans on the moon, right? That happened 50 years ago, very different set of conditions. And so the concept here that they're going to try to test again is U.S. industry capable to the task and able to shoulder the potential cost burdens of something as difficult as landing on the moon? Commercial crew and cargo, which it kind of was originally come from, was the idea being low Earth orbit is a known problem, right? It's a difficult problem, but the set of potential issues that you're dealing with is known enough that a company won't necessarily risk bankruptcy trying to achieve that goal. Landing on the moon, again, kind of known, but again, you look at something like Beresheet from even last year, the Israeli commercial lander, that failed just right off the surface. You had the Indian lander also fail to land on the moon. That is a difficult problem, and the living memory of being able to pull off landing on the moon is rapidly fading away, right? So it's receding into history as the people who were responsible for that basically age out and pass on. So it's still a risk. It's as big a risk, if not a larger risk, to try to do fixed price contracts with private entities to do something as difficult as land on the moon. Now, the flip side of that would be we've run the experiment the other way, which is the classic method of contracting with NASA big projects. During Constellation, the Altair lunar lander, basically as soon as the announcement it slipped past its schedule, budget grew by billions and billions. They were estimating $30-ish billion for the lander in Constellation. It became so expensive that immediately became infeasible. And so we've run the other experiment. It clearly hasn't worked. And so I think it's time to run this other experiment and say, well, we gambled on commercial crew. We seem to be about to pay off on that. That seems to be a reasonable thing to try in order to return humans to the surface of the moon using this different method. And again, through companies like, again, Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin, which are, let's say, well capitalized at the moment, and able to put a lot of their own resources into it.
$1 billion a year of his own money that he said he would invest, independent of any revenue that he generates.
And again, great person to have funding Blue Origin right now. Amazon's only getting richer in this current coronavirus case. So he's only more resource rich in order to support Blue Origin in the next few years.
So nice that Amazon and Blue Origin have come up, because we've got a question from Thomas Pugh, which has to do with that challenge that we're all facing right now. Thomas says, I need to click one more thing here so other people can see it. COVID-19 has had a clear effect on the space industry. Despite that, two major events still slated to happen: Crew Dragon, that we've been talking about, but also Perseverance, which is, as far as we know, on track and just about ready for launch down there at the Kennedy Space Center in July. He's wondering, does public opinion play into this? Does what the public wants, the taxpayers want, do you think that's a significant pressure on NASA to get these things accomplished?
It's a great question. It's difficult to answer in the sense that public polling doesn't happen frequently with regards to NASA issues, right? So at best, we get every couple of years, you'll see the Pew Research Company release some general questions about NASA. If there's big issues, maybe you'll see a few more. I think we saw one from Bloomberg polling last year as well, and they tend to talk about big issues. the interesting thing is if you look at public polling through a historical lens and what NASA does, there's actually not that strong of a correlation between what the public, how invested they are in NASA and NASA's overall goal. Like during the moon landing, right, during Apollo, public polling was not that supportive of the Apollo program. And that was the peak of NASA funding by a big amount, right? And so they actually had these great polling that Roger Lanius, NASA historian, put together saying, you know, is the Apollo program worth it over time, over the 1960s? And the only time that you had more than 50% of the public say that the Apollo program was worth it was in the month following Apollo 11 landing. And so it was one of those situations where, you know, the reasons we go into space, public support is great for that, but there's a lot of other political reasons that drive investments in space exploration, particularly human spaceflight, classically through the lens of the Cold War and so forth, projecting, you know, industrial and economic might. So all of that being said, my interpretation of what's happening in terms of Perseverance and Commercial Crew, it's almost the other way around. It's not necessarily responding to public demand. I would interpret, the way that I interpret is that NASA says this is a great way to demonstrate to the public that there is inspirational, exciting, optimistic, forward-looking things that can still happen, even during all of this, right? I, for one, need and am very much looking forward to seeing something exciting and just purely joyful happening that is as a result of every, you know, thousands, tens of thousands of people peacefully working together for a common goal to do something that, you know, even in its most, you know, kind of like a harsh interpretation is a pretty benign, but all the way up to inspirational motivation of like, let's send people into space. Let's learn about, you know, point at Mars. There's that red dot in the sky. Let's spend years building one of the most complicated robotic systems ever made. And let's go there and ask and answer these questions. Those are just truly beautiful things. So the way that I see it is that it's more of the other way around, that NASA will be using this to improve their image and demonstrate, again, to the public to help lift the mood of the nation.
The mission driving public opinion. I mean, to paraphrase Marshall McLuhan, the mission is the message, I suppose. Here's another one for you. This is from Martin Wettig, and it's kind of related since pretty much everything nowadays, not Commercial Crew necessarily, but Perseverance very much an international mission. He welcomes everybody. He wonders if there are other space agencies in collaboration besides NASA. Now, we know there are other agencies that collaborate with NASA, but are there collaborations that don't include NASA, like ESA, the European Space Agency, working with China, or JAXA, the Japanese agency?
Indeed, there are. We have all many space agencies around the world. ESA is a collaboration between a number of European countries. We also have, of course, Russia, China, Japan. They all have their space agencies. Australia is a new space agency, welcoming to them to the world stage in terms of space exploration. And yes, generally NASA, of course, is the biggest one. They have by far the most amount of money to work with. They have lots of opportunities to engage with other nations on, and there's lots of NASA collaborations with other space agencies, particularly with, I'd say, ESA and JAXA being some of the largest. Huge cooperation with Russia on the International Space Station. Of course, Russia has been launching NASA astronauts into space for the last 10 years after the shuttle retired. So there's a very strong collaboration there. And then, yes, there's collaborations between, for example, ESA and Russia with their ESA's Mars exploration mission, sending their rover to the surface, the ExoMars concept, and launching on Russian rockets, and also carrying some instrumentation and a Russian lander in terms of the 2022 now mission. China has been trying to leverage its investments in space. They're working on building a space station themselves, and they've reached out to ESA and other nations to try to bring on partners with them to, again, build these types of collaborative scientific research capabilities and extend, in a sense, their soft power. Space exploration, in a sense, one of the best spin-offs of space exploration is the international collaborative aspect of it. That you can work together with these other nations, and again, very complex problems, expensive, difficult problems, but with a shared purpose that helps, in a sense, practice and keep a level of dialogue happening between nations, for example, the US and Russia, which have had a somewhat rocky relationship politically on the global stage over the last 10, 15 years. But because they're so tightly interwound with what's happening on the space station, that there's a great way, it's always maintained a certain level of engagement, communication, commitment, because there's that shared purpose has existed throughout that entire otherwise rocky relationship. So it's, again, space international collaboration, I think, is, again, one of the best, if not, top the best spin-off in terms of very practical applications of space exploration.
Yeah, it sure is something to be happy about, that we have more in common with the Russian Federation right now than a red phone on the president's desk, as well as Putin's.
Right.
I've got to throw one up here. It's not a question, but this from Evan Thompson, who's going to write in Bill Nye in November. I'm afraid, Evan, while Bill might appreciate the sentiment, I think he'd probably say, if nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. But who knows? I mean, I think he'd take a ride up on a Crew Dragon before he'd want to become president, frankly. Let me get to another one here, and this is one that's near and dear to you. It comes from Tom Kemp. What's happening with the Planetary Science Caucus in Congress? And Casey, you better explain a little bit about what we're talking about here.
So caucuses in the congressional sense are semi-formal groups of members of Congress that share a certain interest. It's basically raising their hand and saying, I care about this issue. It tells their staff that they care about an issue. And they kind of use it as a loose way to organize interest, votes, legislation, and then just general kind of awareness about these issues. Tons of caucuses out there, right? There's caucuses on, like major health issues, right? Like liver cancer caucus. There's caucuses on, there's the Congressional Black Caucus. There's the Tea Party Caucus, right? There's all sorts of political stripes represented. There's even a Congressional Seersucker Caucus, if you really like dressing up in those suits during the summer in the South. And so the Planetary Society helped a couple members of Congress form the Planetary Science Caucus a few years ago, which has a charter. It's in the House. It's actually a formalized thing. It's less formal in the Senate. But it's a bipartisan, so there's two co-chairs. It's Derek Kilmer from Washington State, and a member from Louisiana. Sorry, because I don't have they just changed, so I have to just look that up real quick. But we have a Republican and Democrat running the caucus, and then we also have about 30 or so members of Congress who are just members of the caucus. And so they do things like they get together, they'll talk about space stuff, we'll reach out to them and share. We have information that goes out to them and their staff every month about major issues in planetary science. And obviously right now with the disruption because of the coronavirus, we don't have a huge amount of activities planned with them because Congress is not really meeting in session. And also the focus of Congress right now is generally on the virus response. And so, but it's one of those things where when we need to activate them, they've already raised their hand and demonstrated, and said that this is an issue that's important to us. And so it's one of those things that we maintain and support to the degree that they can, though ultimately it's a congressional caucus. It's not our caucus, right? We can help them with information, access to people, questions, and so forth. But ultimately it's up to them to use it the best way they possibly can.
Okay. Let's go right on to a question from Tyler Griggs. Can you speak on or about the ISS, the International Space Station program, spending concurrent with a lunar program? And I know this is something that the Planetary Society has considered very carefully, hasn't it?
Yeah, in terms of whether it's possible?
Yeah, I mean, can we afford to do both, I guess, really? And what is the outlook for ISS, as a lot of people in Congress call for its life to be extended beyond what was expected?
Yeah. And by the way, sorry, I just Stephen Palazzo from Mississippi is the other co-chair.
Good recovery. Apologies, Congressman.
Yeah. we switched him up. And this is why we have a member who lives in D.C., our colleague, Brendan Curry, who lives in D.C., managing all these relationships personally. And that's the proper breakdown of that role. But yeah, to the question, can we support both low Earth orbit human exploration efforts and deep space exploration efforts to the moon and onto Mars? At the moment, I don't think the answer is the answer is no. We can't. Not in a serious way. However, the White House for next year, for fiscal year 2021, did propose significant growth for NASA's budget by about what was the top? I think 12%, up to about $25 billion, and all of that that's about an additional $3 billion. All of that money would be going towards lunar exploration. So that is basically the amount that it grows is basically what we spend on the ISS right now. So in that sense, yes, I think if that comes to pass and that budget grows, then you could really manage the space station as it is and still give a real fighting chance toward Artemis, because that's on top of the roughly $3 to $4 billion we already spend right now on the Space Launch System, Orion, basic parts of the Gateway, and other deep space exploration activities. So that's an augmentation to what's already being well spent there. And that's what you really need, again, to pay for the newest thing, which is the lander, and really kind of go forward on Gateway as well. So the question is essentially probably like maybe yes if this comes to pass. And even then it's going to be relatively tight, because human space exploration is just an order of magnitude more difficult and therefore more expensive than robotics, just because you have the level of safety assurance you need is just that much higher, right? You need to keep humans, you need to bring a little bubble of Earth with you into space in order to keep humans alive. And the priority of the mission always is going to be bringing them back safely, right? Literally every other consideration is secondary. And so that's, that just makes it hard to do. And in order to maintain and properly pursue these in a safe way, you got to spend the money to do it. There's no real shortcuts to it.
I was just thinking of, what it takes to take a rocket that has a tremendous level of success like the Falcon 9 and make it human rated, and the years that it's taken to accomplish that. Here's a question from Colton Covington. If you could advocate for any specific program in the Planetary Science Division, what are your top 3 that you would tell everybody to speak to their congressional representatives about? I bet you can come up with 3, Casey.
Oh, I love all my children equally, Matt.
Yes.
No, well, we've laid this out in the Planetary Society on our website at planetary.org/spaceadvocate. We have a set of policy principles that we have outlined and defined about what our top goals are in space exploration, what we fight for every day. And those really come out of our core enterprises at the Planetary Society: planetary exploration, defend the Earth, and search for life. And so I'd say the top 3 that are in the immediate sense that really need support right now, it's the Mars sample return, making sure that's starting up a major new program, that this is this audacious idea to go to Mars, land, grab samples, put them into a rocket, launch that rocket into space, dock autonomously at Mars, and then come back and then land on Earth. Never been done before, right? That's a difficult thing to do. Again, autonomously from 100 million miles away, so you can't even control it remotely. It's all on its own, effectively, to pull this off. That's a big deal. We're just getting started. The Perseverance rover is going to be collecting the samples, step 1. Step 2 is going to be building the lander to go pick up those samples and then launch them, at a rocket to launch them into space. And then step 3 is going to be having the spacecraft to autonomously grab those samples in Mars orbit and then come back to Earth. That's the next decade of Mars exploration right there. Planetary defense is the other big issue. NEOSM is how you say it, the Near-Earth Object Surveillance Mission. This is basically a Sentinel spacecraft sitting out at one of our Lagrange points looking for potentially hazardous asteroids and comets, things that could hit Earth. I think if we learn anything from this coronavirus pandemic we're going through right now, that a little bit of investment into prevention and early detection and testing will pay off, right? Planetary calamity from asteroids hitting the Earth. low probability, just like a big pandemic, right? Not a high probability, but very high impact if it happens, right? So we can put a little bit of money into looking for them, asteroids and comets that could harm the Earth. Probably should put a little bit of money into that before, we find out the hard way that one was coming our way. There's a spacecraft, again, it's called the NEO Surveillance Mission, that is starting to get some funding through the through appropriations, but also through the NASA request. It's not a priority, though. And so right now, Congress has actually mandated NASA to find 90% of all, kind of what we call city killer asteroids. Asteroids about 140 meters in diameter. So pretty chunky, but small enough on the cosmic scale that they're hard to find with Earth telescopes. And so you can, that 90% goal, or not goal, mandate made by Congress, that is actually due this year. NASA is only about 30% of the way there. It's not NASA's fault. They just never got the funding to pursue it. They need the spacecraft dedicated to finding these things. So NASA, it's included in the budget at a minimal level, and it wouldn't launch until the end of next decade. So we need to get some increased funding for that now, and we could launch it as early as 2025, and then within a few years, it gets you almost to that 90% level in terms of its detection rate. So that's, I think, a really important one. That's a very practical one. Going back to public support, that is something that was brought up in terms of public polling. That is one of the highest publicly supported activities of NASA, is looking for dangerous asteroids. So again, not too hard to figure out what that one is. Very relevant for most people. If you ask them, do you want to, die by asteroid collision from above? Most people will say no. And I think that's an easy thing for NASA to be able to support and say, we're helping, we're helping prevent planetary calamities. So those are I think, two big ones. And then I think really stepping forward, the scientific community is about to go through this huge process. It's called the Kado Survey. It's through the National Academy of Sciences in the United States. And it's a kind of a very important, long process, about 18 months. But it's basically the entire planetary science community comes together and argues, vigorously, but scientifically argues for what the next decade of exploration should look like. What are the biggest questions? How would we approach those questions? What types of missions would answer or make progress to answering those questions? The results of that will come out, I think, in 2021, maybe 2022, I think off the top of my head, at least the next year. And that will be important to support that going forward. That basically sets the conditions. The last one, this is why we have the Mars Perseverance rover. It's why we have the Europa Clipper. Both of those were high priority recommendations of the last decadal survey report. So those are going to be important to support going forward. And I would say just the last thing is just the search for life. And this is what it really comes down to for us, is that the size of the question, right, of the search for life, and the implications. They're one of those things that it's like why we love space, right? It's like what Carl Sagan was able to stir in your soul through his beautiful words. It's just when you are confronted with something so immense and so humbling as the fact that, of finding life beyond Earth, finding a second Genesis, finding, any sort of information about how life is it an inevitable result of the same similar physical mix, or is there something special about it? That is kind of why we do this stuff, is answering these like deep, profound, almost existential questions. And we have ways to do that. That's the amazing thing, is in the last few decades, the question of life is not just, we've understood and kind of put a bunch of effort into understanding how early life came onto Earth, understanding questions about how you define life, physical and chemical properties. And the question that you just interviewed Kevin Hand, who works on the Europa lander concept studies right now. And he always talks about this idea of like, where would we look for living life, right? Does biology exist on Earth the same way it exists everywhere else? We've demonstrated that for physics. The physics of Earth are the same as the physics out there. The chemistry on Earth is the same as the chemistry out there. And now the question is, does the biology that happens on Earth, is that similar processes to any potential biology that happens out there? We have the ability to answer that if we want to. And so, you would support that, again, as specific missions like Mars Perseverance, by Europa Clipper, by really investing in ocean worlds exploration, right? We have like these habitable oceans, probably all throughout our own solar system, right? The concept of the habitable zone has completely blown open into this new arena to explore. We can search those things out and really start to look. Things like the James Webb Space Telescope, it's successor telescopes that could be even bigger, directly imaging and looking at the contents of biosignatures in the atmospheres of thousands of exoplanets. These are doable problems. They're not problems that are so hard we don't even know how to solve them. There are pathways that are clear to pursue. We can pursue those.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Kevin Hand, who is my guest this week on Planetary Radio, and the author of a terrific book, a new book, Alien Oceans, which I highly recommend. So I would have put that vote in as well for a Europa lander, having just spoken to him, but also for an Enceladus orbiter to fly through.
Or an Enceladus sample return.
Why not?
Fly through the plumes of Enceladus, bring that stuff back.
Dream
How
big.
cool would that be?
We got a couple of questions. Oh, and Casey, I'm hoping you can stick around for another few minutes here. I know both of us have stuff to do on the hour, but we're at about 35 past now, and maybe we can go for another 10 minutes or so.
I can go all the way up to 10 or later.
Okay. All right. I can't do 10.
I can't shut up about this stuff, so I'm happy to keep answering questions if you got them.
And it's good stuff that you have to say. Maybe we'll go for until 50 past the hour or something like that, and I'll have a couple of minutes to get ready for the next thing I've got. But let me throw this question at you because it represents at least a couple of others that we've also been picking up. And this from Steve Greenberg, who apparently was with you in D.C. not long ago. He says, we were part of the Day of Action, and we're pretty proud to participate. Anything we, the members, can be doing for the society while we are self-isolating, basically?
Yeah, great question. So right now, in terms of direct congressional action, it's not really the right time. Right. So we need to, at the same, being a strategic advocate, it's good to know when not to push on an issue if it's not we don't want to seem out of touch. There's obviously really immediate things to solve right now. And we have people in DC and we're working with other partners to keep issues important, but at the same time, not to alienate the people we're trying to work with. Because again, the big problem obviously is responding to the virus and all the political issues falling out from that. So what can society members do or space advocates do right now? I think some of the most important things you can do first, obviously, is continue supporting the Planetary Society, right? There's going to be a lot of work we have to do getting ready for the next presidential term or new administration coming up. And so that's investment for our program. So if you are able to continue or to begin supporting the society financially, that's a really good way to help position ourselves for the next 4 years of whoever we have as president. And then brushing up on your policy familiarity. So, Steve, you've taken the online course, but there's Space Advocacy 101 at courses.planetary.org. That's a great course to learn a lot of basics about how the government works, how space policy gets developed, ways to read the budgets, and so forth. And then I think just generally, really, we're all stuck at home. We're all looking for something positive or escapist to do, sharing some of the beautiful things that we get back from space, right? Space is relevant in the sense that it gives us, it literally forces us to look up and out, right? Human beings, generally, we are just drawn to look inward, focus on ourselves. We're very obviously egocentric. And that's fine, that's just how we are. But at the same time, we need to balance that out. And space is the perfect way to just tear ourselves away from our own internal issues and to look into, be exposed to new information, challenging new ideas, but also, again, that confrontation with your own soul to the infinite, and essentially, right? That relationship, that struggle, that's what sparks that joy and passion and, that in a sense, that existential comfort, in a sense of seeing that the world is bigger, that the cosmos is bigger than us. And we get to enjoy the ride for a little while. So I think sharing some of these beautiful things that are coming out from space, the society has been sharing a lot of great images, providing a lot of resources. And so when we're ready to take action again, everyone is, kind of they're read up on their issues. They followed the news. They've gotten their friends engaged. And it's the really great, exciting, beautiful parts of space. Sharing what happened, the launch happening in May with Commercial Crew, the launch happening in July with Perseverance. And then when we need to take political action, people are primed and ready to go. So right now, I would say take care of yourself and then use space as kind of a mental health escape to help you and people you care about to think about the future in an optimistic, exciting way, and to remind ourselves that there's these big things out there that all we have to do is do them. And we can we can discover these amazing, exciting things and also just be exposed to beauty. So I think those are some of the most important things we can do right now.
And here's an additional sales pitch in that direction from Joseph Ladd, who hopes the current state of affairs doesn't interrupt next year's Day of Action. Let this be a plug for those who haven't heard to come to D.C. and advocate for space exploration with the Planetary Society. How can people stay abreast of what our plans are for the Day of Action next year? Hopefully it'll be in person and not virtual.
Hopefully. We still haven't made that decision, to be frank. We're just following that really closely. Again, the Day of Action, it happened this year in February, about a month before the pandemic broke out. So in that sense, we were lucky, but it was a great event. And just to clarify for anyone watching, it was about 115 people from 28 different states as far as Alaska coming to Washington, D.C. all together. We did 161 meetings in one day with members of Congress and their staff. A day of training, just a great time together to meet other society members, talk about space politics, and just to walk around and to show your support, right? To really invest your passion in it. It's one of my favorite things that I get to do here at the Society is sharing that time with our members and seeing that passion. Every time I go, I'm just truly inspired by the people who support the Society, right? To see their passion, to see their commitment. It makes me want to work harder every single day after I've been exposed to that. So it's just such a great event. And so I don't want to lose that either. I want that to be in person as well. But at the same time, ethically, we have to make sure we balance out. We are literally bringing people from all across the country into one place where you shake a lot of hands and then you disperse back to your homes. And so we have to ethically make sure we balance that out given where we are in those conditions next year. So obviously, we're going to follow that really closely, and we'll do something. And then hopefully it'll be in person if we're able to do that.
Yeah, let's hope that vaccine is in place and a lot of inoculated space fans are ready to head for D.C. Early next year. Here's an interesting one, which you've already touched on a little bit. You mentioned the importance of characterizing exoplanets as we discover more and more of them, thousands of them now confirmed. So we got this from Alan Galathinius, which I bet I mangled. Sorry about that, Alan. Are there any missions currently in the works or underway that are looking for exoplanets? And I know of a couple. There's TESS that has been up there for a little while, and Europe just launched the CHEOPS mission, right?
Yeah, so there are missions that are basically telescopes trying to detect the presence of exoplanets around stars. We've done that with Kepler, as you pointed out, 2 missions happening now through various means. James Webb Space Telescope will be able to do some characterization of exoplanets with its powerful telescope. And there's lots of ground-based telescopes, some of which the Society helps support with our exoplanet research programs that can look and detect them from the ground. Now, I wasn't quite sure from how the question was phrased if there's any mission going to an exoplanet. And that's actually a really cool concept. And there's some really early studies happening right now for how to do something like that, right? You have the Interstellar, the Breakthrough program.
Starshot. Yeah.
Starshot, looking at how you would get just, anything out to another star system versus, another planet. I mean, at that length, at that distance, you're just facing some very difficult physical limitations in terms of transmissible power, how your, level of autonomy, where your power source is coming from, how long it'll take to get there, how does it communicate back, how does it respond to various unknown phenomena, various situations. Like you would need really, really, really advanced, in a sense, AI to be able to self-correct and diagnose its own engineering issues or software problems, and then be able to send data back to Earth that we would have to have somehow be able to receive. There's a lot of just physical problems about going to an exoplanet. There's a really cool concept actually being pursued by our founder of the Planetary Society, the emeritus founder, Lou Friedman, working with several other companies as a concept of basically you go out, way out beyond the sun to the point where you can actually use the sun as a gravitational lens. So the light will bend around the sun, and if you can catch that bend where the two light rays connect, it actually works as basically a magnifying lens. And theoretically, you could try to do that, line it up, and get an image of an exoplanet that you could then send back to Earth, like a full picture of an exoplanet. It's a very technically ambitious and risky mission. You're talking, I forget exactly, 500 AU, extremely, very, very far out beyond the solar system. But that's under I think they just won an early NASA breakthrough, like research grant to kind of study that
phase
more.
3 NIAC grant, which there are very few of those awarded, to continue to explore this. In fact, we hope to talk with Lou Friedman and his partner Slava Turishev about this on Planetary Radio before long. But NASA has some confidence that this is worth looking at.
Yeah. Well, and so this is, to tie it back to policy and the political thing. How do you make sure something like that eventually happens? Right, those are hard things to do. This is like a multi-generational effort to do something like this. And you actually had one of the great supporters of planetary science in Congress, John Culberson, who is now no longer in Congress, but when he was actually starting to direct money to interstellar mission concept studies. And so, but he was one person, and that money is largely dissipated since he's gone. His role was in basically funding NASA in the House of Representatives. So he had a lot of power over that. So it's the kind of work that's being done now, these really early stage work, that you start to build up the political consensus in a sense. And you need to build at the same time a scientific consensus that these are worthy investments. And, as much as we'd love lots of more money available for NASA, there's only so much that's going to be spent on NASA. So it's ultimately some sort of a trade-off. Do you invest in these long-term payoff, highly exciting but risky projects, or do you get the science you can get much closer to home and guarantee that you're getting something back, right? And there's no right answer. It's just a balance between those two things.
Yeah.
And so what we could do as space advocates now is start to help build that political consensus to help these ongoing projects. So maybe we won't see that first picture of an exoplanet, but maybe our grandchildren will see that first exoplanet picture because we did the legwork necessary to enable that project to happen.
And those telescopes, of course, are getting better and better and better, both the ground-based and the space ones. Knocking on wood for James Webb Space Telescope to launch now next year.
Next year.
Casey, we got about 2 minutes left. I dare you to try and answer this one in those 2 minutes that are left. And thank you to all of you who've submitted questions and comments today. As always happens with this, we're not going to be able to get to everybody. But I believe we will be back with another Space Policy Edition Live, part of this Planetary Society Live series. So keep track of our rotation here on Thursdays. We're going to try and do this every week out of the Planetary Society at planetary.org/live. But here you go, Casey. It's a big one. It says his Twitter handle is Space Research and Analysis. How can we use space exploration to help the poor? I would say, to start us off, that certainly space development already has done a great deal to help those who are disadvantaged around our planet, particularly through Earth observation and increasingly communication satellites. But what's your take, Casey?
Yeah, so what do I have, 90 seconds?
Yeah, about that.
But that's an important question. This is something that is worth every space advocate deeply considering and having a ready response to it. In any modern society, we have to have a balance in terms of what our society does to address immediate needs and to kind of essentially plant the seed corn for future flourishing of humanity. And so you can, and I think correctly in the United States and many other nations, we invest the vast majority of our money in programs to support health, Social Security, and support for disadvantaged individuals economically. And at the same time, in order to maintain the technological growth that ultimately will help us find new ways to provide new economies, new industries, new ways of addressing the needs of humans, you need to invest in basic research and technology. And you don't know what's going to come out of that basic investment by definition, right? If you knew, it wouldn't be a basic research anymore. But we know that by doing so, historically, something has always come out that has made its value back to the overall economy, right? ARPANET, something, early investments in basic research for computing, and then through internet, basically connecting computers together. NSF helping to support that with also defense research project money coming in to help create these distributed computing clusters. Now you have a whole new, obviously we're talking on the result of that, but think about the wealth created for all sorts of people who never had that access before through those early weird, mathematical and computer science theoretical work being done for distributed networked computing, right? Something out of CERN. CERN created, looking at particle physics, the fundamental structure of reality. They needed a way to quickly connect all of this vast amounts of data they were generating. So, they created, a guy at CERN created this protocol called, and just called it HTTP in the World Wide Web, right? And that wasn't the necessary outcome of investing in particle physics, but that more than, I would say, pays for everything else. And think of the amount of people lifted out of poverty because of opportunities provided by this whole new industry that sprang out of nowhere, right? That we had no idea was coming. And this goes to a larger thing, and I recommend we talked about this on our last episode of Planetary Radio Space Policy Edition. We had this guy, Jim Schwartz, he's a philosopher on it, talking about his new book, where he argued that space exploration isn't just important, but we have a moral obligation to do it. And he makes a much more complete philosophical argument behind it, but the ultimate idea is that because scientifically motivated exploration helps basically test, and that basic idea that it's bringing new information from without, it's forcing us to grapple with that new information, challenges our understanding of the world, and through that process, through that churn, through that struggle, we inadvertently create things that are helpful to everybody. And we don't know exactly how it happens in advance, but we know that it does in the process of doing that. And particularly for open societies, for liberal democracies, small liberal democracies, that is an incredibly important aspect of a healthy civic society and ultimately a growing economic society that can support more and more people and lift them out of poverty. So this is more than 2 minutes, but the basic idea is that we always prioritize the immediate needs of people, but we have to always ensure that we're investing in the future. And you invest in the future by challenging incredibly smart people, by giving lots of people the opportunities to participate in that, right? Through space, which is this very open concept. Anyone, bringing in students into STEM and difficult, challenging technical and mathematical fields. Space is a great carrot for that. And then the smart people churning on these difficult problems will inevitably pay back to the overall society in the long term.
Well said, Casey. And you heard Casey mention that most recent episode of the Space Policy Edition. You can hear it at planetary.org/radio, or just look for us on the homepage for the Planetary Society, planetary.org. And the next episode of Space Policy Edition is coming up on Monday, June 6th, because we are the first Friday of every month, almost every month, but yeah, it's a pretty good rule. 4 years now of monthly Space Policy Editions and 17 and a half years of Planetary Radio, the series that I am very proud to host and produce for the Planetary Society. I'll leave you with one last message. We'll give Martin Wettig the last word here. Awesome Q&A round, by the way. I could watch this for hours. Well, then come back next time, Martin, and join us the next time Space Policy Edition goes live with Casey Dreier, the Chief Advocate and Senior Space Policy Advisor for the Planetary Society. Great work, Casey, as always. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to everyone for asking those great questions. As you know, I could go on for hours here, given the chance. Though Matt has better things to do.
We'll just spread it out. I'm Mat Kaplan of the Planetary Society. Hope you'll consider joining us if you're not already a member. Planetary.org/membership is where you can learn about all of the many benefits, both of being a member and of the benefits that you can provide for the United States and for the entire world as we become spacefarers, exploring and developing the reaches beyond Earth's atmosphere. We'll leave it at that for now. Stay safe and well, everybody, and join us again for the next Planetary Society Live next Thursday. Thanks a lot. Ad Astra.